Your family has a long line of lawyers, right?
Yes, I was born into a genetic prison from which I could not escape. So that is my misfortune.
You are one of the most high-profile criminal Queen's Counsel in all of England. You had to obviously earn that. And part of that, did you find yourself at some point actually having Fatu, Bensouda, and Hassan Jallow work for you in a project?
Well, way back, and I'm going back to 1981, and the day is burned into my mind because it was the 29th of July 1981, when there was a royal wedding in England, and the Queen's eldest son, Prince Charles, was getting married to his first wife. And then at such a wedding, all the leaders of the Commonwealth are of course invited, and the British Commonwealth, and of course one such country, a former British colony, was a country called the Gambia, which is a small country in the west coast of Africa. Now, the leader of that country was in London for this wedding, and as often happens, there was a coup d'etat, and it was a Marxist coup d'etat. And this was 1981, it was the height of the Cold War, of course, which most people have forgotten about these days. And the Gambia had a river which was, I think, 300 miles long and 100 miles deep water navigable. And the Marxists who took over that government invited the Russians in. And for 250 years, it was Russian foreign policy to look for what they called a warm water port. And so for the first time, they were presented with this warm water port on a platter by this Marxist government that had taken over, this Marxist coup d'etat had led to this government that had taken over in the Gambia, and people started getting very twitchy, particularly on this side of the Atlantic. I mean, there were some congressmen talking about preemptive nuclear strikes against Russia because the Atlantic routes could have been cut and so on and so forth, and the Russians could have put several fleets, including nuclear fleets, into the Gambia. And so there was a serious problem that arose. But anyway, the long and the short of the story is that the coup d'etat was put down by troops that went in from Britain and other places. And in due course, I got sent out by the Foreign Office in London to see what could be done in prosecuting those who were responsible for this coup d'etat, this Marxist coup d'etat. I went out and I decided that the only way in which the people who sought to overthrow the lawful government could be brought to justice for high treason was if the British government and the government of the Gambia agreed that all judges should come in from abroad and all prosecutors should come in from abroad. That was simply because it was a very small country and everybody had been touched by the coup d'etat and passions were running high. And so I found myself with Hassan Jallow, who I'm going to see later on today. He was a young man in the Attorney General's Department, and I was the chief special prosecutor. And if I remember right, the current chief prosecutor of the ICC, she was my registrar.
Wow.
So we all worked together then, and this was the first internationalized court after Nuremberg in Tokyo. And people don't realize it, and people don't know about it.
Yeah.
But it was set up in 1981 by myself and two of the people I've just mentioned, together with others. But I came to the conclusion that justice could only be seen to be done if, in fact, the prosecutors all came in from outside, and indeed the judges came in from outside. And that was what I did. I refused to conduct any prosecutions unless those terms were met. And so those terms were met, and if I remember right, I think 40 people were prosecuted. The only penalty under the 1351 Act was death. In those days, they didn't mess around, and so. But I think most of those convictions most of those sentences were commuted. I mean, before I left, I wrote a letter to the president saying, you know, when you look down the trail of a nation's history, you see it lit with lanterns, and the lantern of humanity is the one that burns brightest. There were 16 people, if I recall right, in the dock, and they were charged with high treason. They were the people who had formally taken independence from Britain, but they had lost an election, and the new government, under a man called Stevens, was determined to set up a one-party state. But in order to do so, he decided to eliminate his opponents instead of simply taking them to some beach and shooting them. He decided to invent a case of treason against them. And so you had in the dock the former Attorney General, the Cabinet Secretary, and so on and so on. The whole panoply of those who matter in government. And so there were 16 of them, and I was defending one of them. And, well, the trial took, I can't remember, took about a year or so, and during which I found that the foreign minister of that country was giving perjured evidence against the defendants in the dock. And I decided to challenge him, and I decided to challenge him vigorously, as one would a lying witness. Whereupon the Chief Justice, who was hearing the case, panicked, because he said there was a foreign minister at the dock, in the witness box, and there was I, sort of a young man, being rude, he thought, to this man to whom he owed deference. And so he told me to stop. And he said that I should show respect to the witness. And my reply was, something to this effect, that the witness should command respect and not demand it through the judge. Whereupon, this man, the foreign minister, leant out the witness box and said, "I will get you." And 3 days later, I was arrested. I was thrown in jail. I was thrown in jail twice. They tried me on a fake charge of taking brandy into the prison when I was going to have a conference with my client. It was a long, complicated story. But the object was to make me leave the country, to run away. But I didn't. I stayed. And eventually the cases against me were thrown out. There was no evidence. But the purpose was to make my life extremely difficult. Then there was an attempt on my life a few months later, because you could hear, I just left court, and you hear the fut of shots hitting a wall. And nothing is more exciting than being shot at and missed.
Well, that's one description.
There are always sort of moral issues in international justice. You see, to bring people to justice is a very pure idea. Do we sometimes put purity ahead of life? I say it for this reason. You have at the moment this terrible war going on in Syria, where Assad has turned his guns on his own people, and hundreds of thousands have been killed. Assad knows perfectly well that if he falls from power, or if he goes into exile, he will be prosecuted and he will suffer the same penalties as Charles Taylor. So does that make him go on fighting? Mm-hmm. Does that mean that more people are dying as a result of international justice. In other words, is there a chance that, could there be a chance that some country, his friends, the Russians, for example, could say, right, you come into exile here, you'll be safe. And so he leaves. And then Syria sorts itself out. But he, of course, knows that were he to fall into the hands of the ICC, he will be faced with a trial. I don't think he's been indicted yet, but I think there's plenty of evidence of genocide and crimes against humanity against him. And he doesn't want to face that. So does international justice lead to people being killed as a result? In other words, do wars go on for longer because people find that they have no other option than to keep fighting? I don't know. This is one of the great moral questions. I mean, I've answered it in my own mind by saying, well, at the heart of the rule of law is the concept that the law is above you. The law is above everybody. And if some people are allowed to commit terrible crimes and then go into exile, then you are in fact saying that some people are exempt from the rule of law. And the moment some people become exempt from the rule of law, that is when the rule of law comes to an end. Mm-hmm. I mean, that is my point of view. But there are many who disagree with me and say, no, if he was given a let-out, he could go to Iran, or if Assad was given a let-out, he could go to Iran, for example, and flee there with his family, and then the killing will probably stop. Now, these are the moral questions that go with the legal ones. Those who are lawyers in this room will have to ponder in their minds in due course. Is it purity or is it life? Is it justice or is it peace? I mean, but anyway, these are philosophical questions, but people have got to answer it for themselves. Charles Taylor, a trial. Of course, that panicked the president of Nigeria because he was then faced with this promise that he'd given to the international community. Yes, I will surrender Charles Taylor if the lawful government of Liberia asked for him. In fact, he had no business making that condition because Charles Taylor at that time was an indicted war criminal, and the duty of President Obasanjo, the president of Nigeria, was in fact to hand him over. However, one must remember international politics is such that the West, the United States, and so on and so forth, was very dependent on Nigeria because in all these operations that were taking place in Africa, where peacekeeping troops were needed, neither the US nor Britain or France or anybody else wanted to put their own troops in. And Nigeria was putting her troops in order to maintain peace in many cases. So Nigeria was acting as a regional power, in return for which Nigeria was hoping that the Security Council, if expanded, as you all know, there are 5 permanent members of the Security Council who are the most powerful countries within it. Nigeria was hoping to be considered to be, or added to, this number of permanent members of the Security Council. And I took the view that if in fact Nigeria was giving house room to a wanted war criminal, then I would do the same as my counterpart in The Hague was doing, Carlo Del Ponte, who, when Serbia wanted to join the European Union, Carlo Del Ponte said, no, I will object to that because you have failed to surrender Mladic and Karadzic and people like that, who at that time were being looked for. Mm-hmm. I took up the same position with Nigeria and said, I will object. I will object to you being considered but by the Security Council because you are continuing to give house room to a wanted war criminal. And it was on that basis that I eventually got him. Those of you who've seen photographs of Charles Taylor, and outside custody, or indeed in court, would realize he's a man who always dressed impeccably. And I had a message from him that could I please give him 3 days to have some clothes sent from London and Paris, because if he was going to make an appearance in court, he intended to make to cut a dash. So, being the sort of chap I am, I said, of course I will. So gave him 3 days' grace so he could appear in court properly attired, properly booted and spurred. So there we are. So those are the little sort of side stories to this.